detailed history of the Federal Reserve note. Well, before we dive into the actual history, there's a little bit of background that comes to this. As of April 1 of 1913, a particular combination of officers in the Treasury, which would be Burke as the treasurer and McAdoo as the secretary of the Treasury, is the combination that you'll be seeing on the very earliest Federal Reserve notes. And it was on December 23rd that President Wilson signed the whole Federal Reserve Act into law. The Federal Reserve Act created 12 banks at that time, and to this day, the same 12 banks are the banks of the Federal Reserve. So, but you'll notice the banks are a little bit more close together in the northeast part of the country than they are in the southwest. So let's look at the way they were. Okay, the first one, as they numbered it just from one end of the country to the other, was 1, or A, and that would be the Bank of Boston, Massachusetts. The next one, which is 2, or B, is the Bank of New York City in the state of New York. And the third one, which would be C, is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So look at that. All those are very closely positioned geographically. Now we're getting a little more scattered, kind of intermediate, as we move on to number 4, which is D, in Cleveland, Ohio. Number 5, which is E, which is in Richmond, Virginia. Number 6, which is F, which is in Atlanta, Georgia. Then, going a little further west, we've got G, which is in Chicago, Illinois. We got H, which is in St. Louis, Missouri. And we have I, which is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then we have J, which is in Kansas City, again in Missouri. And K, which is in Dallas, Texas. And L, which is San Francisco, California. Obviously, population shifts have gone very different. California, in particular, has become a great deal more populous than it was in 1913. Arizona and New Mexico have gained substantially, and Oregon and Washington, the western states in general, have grown a great deal. And yet all of those states and anything else to the west, such as Hawaii and so forth, are all still the same. The territories remain the same. The oddest thing in all of this that I'm seeing is that given that the United States had 48 states in 1913, because Alaska and Hawaii weren't there yet, but New Mexico and Arizona had just joined up the year before. So they had different regions allocated, and as I said, they get larger geographically as you go to the southwest, as opposed to relatively tiny in the northeast. So that just represents the population shift, but the territories remain the same. The interesting part is to see that while there's 48 states, and only 12 of these Federal Reserve banks, the rather surprising thing is to see that there's actually 2 in the state of Missouri, St. Louis, and then again in Kansas City. But the one in Missouri, well, the state itself is kind of cut in half between these various regions, and so one faces east and the other one faces other places to the west. So that's kind of what they did there. So those were the banks that were created. The idea was to create a kind of a central bank that, by being a number of separate semi-independent banks, could create more of a little autonomy and therefore maybe some competition among them in some ways that might keep them from conspiring too closely together, as a single central bank could kind of monopolize everything. Well, anyway, it was signed into law in 1913, And it was in 1914 that the very first Federal Reserves made their introduction. And this is how they all looked. They were large size, as all banknotes were at the time. They had red seal and red serial numbers. And as you can see, they all have that same look to them, with the variations for that. And you'll see the treasurer of Burke and the secretary of the Treasury, McAdoo. So there they are. It says Federal Reserve Note, and at the top and at the bottom, and it has the United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $5. So it's not even claiming that this is of itself $5. It's just a guarantee that if you take this to some place or other, they will pay you $5. So it goes series of 1914. It says that at both ends. And on the back side, we have some more verbiage that's kind of important. You can see it's got fives in the corners, $5 at the top up here, Federal Reserve Note, and $5 again here. That can vary a little bit. The most important verbiage, however, is that at the bottom here, which reads, "This note is receivable by all national and member banks and Federal Reserve banks, and for all taxes, customs, and other public dues. It is redeemable in gold on demand at the Treasury Department of the United States in the city of Washington, District of Columbia, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank." So there it is. It specifically was redeemable in gold or what it called lawful money, which would be anything else. Other notes of other kinds, some of which were guaranteed, like the national bank notes that were guaranteed by securities, silver, and of course gold is mentioned specifically. Also the notes that stand for each of those. So it had these different things that it could represent. Now you look at each denomination here, same signatures, series of 1914 and a little circle at each end. And again, Federal Reserve Note, top and bottom. United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $10. So this is all the same. And the ink only looks faded on this one just because something's happened to it. It's not that there was a different shade of ink used. Now, as we get to here, again, it's got the denomination at the top, and then I get the bottom, a Federal Reserve Note, and the denomination. Let's take a brief look at here. We have here and here a couple of scenes. I think one of these may represent a battle scene, or maybe the Pilgrims. I'm not sure. Haven't been able to make them out. On the $10, it's a little more obvious. We're dealing with agriculture on the one hand and industry on the other. The next one up is the $20. And so again, Federal Reserve Note at the top and bottom. Bank of America will pay to the bearer on demand $20. And now up here is series of 1914, and here series of 1914. And there's Burke and McAdoo, and all our red seals. And here again, now this has to do with the way we were a nation on the move. We had transportation, we had trains, we had automobiles, even airplanes were beginning to make something of an appearance. That's a typical airplane for 1914. Well, for that matter, a typical car for 1914. You know, as well as our vast shipping and harbor. That seems to be New York City there in the background, a little tugboat or something in the foreground. And there's the Statue of Liberty, which pretty well indicates New York Harbor. Maybe that's a bit of New Jersey way in the distance there. And all the same verbiage here, again, is redeemable in gold on demand at the Treasury, Washington, D.C., or gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. So even though This particular note would be tied, for example, in this case, in New York, or this one to Cleveland, or this one to St. Louis. And as we go on, this one to Minneapolis, and this one to Kansas City. All banks will honor all of these things, provide all those redemption values in gold or lawful money equally, because it's the whole Federal Reserve Bank system. Now we have here the $50. Again, it's got all the same things, Federal Reserve note on top and bottom, and then United States of America, paying series of 1914. And on the back of the 50, now this is kind of unusual. This particular imagery is commemorating the creation of the Panama Canal, which has happened about the same time. And so the use of the two oceans here refers to the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, which had finally been connected so that ships could move from one to the other. Little sailing ships there, or other bigger ships, cargo ships, maybe battleships, who knows, whatever. Any ship can just pass through the Panama Canal. So that was a very big deal. And finally, you have the $100. So Scott Franklin. Now let's look at who's on them. Lincoln's on the $5, as he still is on there. Jackson, however, was on the 10. As we know, he's been moved to the 20. Grover Cleveland was on the 20, and we will see he moves over to the $1,000. Then you have Grant, who's on the 50 and is still on the 50. And you have Benjamin Franklin, who's on the 100 and is still on the 100, albeit with a different picture. So these are the Federal Reserve notes in their very, very first appearance, before anything else, before the higher denominations that would come later, before other changes that would be made to these things, and also before the introduction of the other product of the Federal Reserve, namely the Federal Reserve banknote, which, however, I don't intend to discuss in this series. That'll be for another video of its own at some other point. So this is where we were. They had red seals. They had Burke and McAdoo. They were exchangeable in gold as well as lawful money, whatever that means. And they were always a matter of the United States of America, not so much any bank, but actually the country as a whole. The nation, the government was accepting these notes as an obligation to itself so much, and not merely so much to the individual bank, which, by the way, that is not true of the other one, the Federal Reserve banknote. So this will lead the way to what will be our next step. We will glance at briefly, but next we will explore it. The first major change to take place would be that the seals go from red to blue, and so do the serial numbers. So you'll see they have all the same designs and patterns, statements, everything. They even still have the signatures of Burke and McAdoo. They also have all the same language. They have the same artwork on the back, the same, this note is receivable, etc. All that is exactly the same. The note has not changed. And what's interesting is it is receivable for everything: taxes, interest on the public debt, customs, anything, everything, as well as all normal salaries and other normal uses. But we will continue this next phase in the next video.